السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So yesterday, what did we talk about yesterday? Naam? That's today. Asbab al-Nuzul. Okay, so you're paying attention. Obviously I'm not. Asbab al-Nuzul. So today we're going to talk about the verses that were revealed, the Meccan verses and the Medina verses. What does that mean? So the Prophet ﷺ, we know, lived in Mecca for 13 years, and then after the Hijrah was in Medina for 10 years. So we're saying that throughout those 23 years there was revelation that was coming. So one of the things that the ulama of the Quran, and by the way, all of the ulama of the different disciplines are very much concerned with Mecca and Medina issues, and I'll give you an example of why that's important. But for the purposes of the Quran, they have three definitions for Meccan and Medina verses. The first definition, which is the standard definition and the pretty much the majority, is that everything that was revealed before the Hijrah is considered a Meccan verse, and anything that was revealed after the Hijrah is considered a Medina verse. So this is about demarcating, with the Hijrah demarcates the time. Because in the Mecca period, there were times in which the Prophet ﷺ was not in Mecca. He would go to Ta'if or somewhere else and revelation was revealed. And likewise in the Medina period, the Prophet ﷺ went back to Mecca for Hajj, and there were all of these battles. So this definition uses the demarcation of the Hijrah. Based on this demarcation, the majority of the surahs, the entire surahs, are considered Meccan, and about 29 are considered Medina surahs. The second definition is it's geographical. Anything that was revealed in Mecca or its surrounding areas are Meccan verses. Anything that was revealed in Medina or surrounding areas are Medina verses, which is obviously very limiting, because how about all of the other places the Prophet ﷺ went? And then the third definition, which is even more limiting, is that Meccan verses are verses that are addressed to the people of Mecca, like Ya ayyuhan nas, O people. Whereas Medina verses are those that are addressed to the people of Medina. So that's even more narrow. And that's why we use the first definition as a standard definition. So the simple question is, what is a Mecca and Medina verse? The answer is anything revealed before the Hijrah is considered a Meccan verse or surah. Anything that was revealed after the Hijrah is considered a Medina or Madani surah or chapter. If you go to the end of the Mus'haf, you will see by each surah's name, it's Meccan or Medina, and sometimes in the banner on the top, here we don't have it, but sometimes like where it says the surah on the top, it will also say Meccan or Medina. This one doesn't have it. This one just tells us how many verses and the chapter number. It doesn't matter, but somewhere in the Mus'haf it will be written Meccan and Medina. Now you know why there might be a difference of opinion about how many surahs are Meccan and Medina. Now, obviously this is not a perfect definition, because based on this definition, there will be verses that were revealed in Medina, technically Medina verses, but were revealed when the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca, and vice versa. So the discipline of knowing whether the verses are Meccan or Medina or Madanese is very, very, they get into the weeds. Which some surahs, for example, the long surahs, Al-Baqarah, etc., those are all considered Madanese. But there might be verses inside those surahs that were revealed during the Meccan period, before. And remember, when Gabriel would reveal the Quran to the Prophet ﷺ, part of the revelation is he would tell the Prophet ﷺ where to place the verses, after which verse, before which verse, in which surah, so on and so forth. As we said, the order is tawqifi, it comes from revelation. So, one of the things that we can benefit from this, generally speaking, this is just a generalization, what do the Meccan verses sound like and look like versus what do the verses of Medina? Generally speaking, the verses revealed in Mecca talk about issues of belief. So they establish the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the heavens and the earth. They talk a lot about what will happen in the hereafter. They will also reveal stories that came from the previous prophets. Because remember, this was in these 13 years, the Prophet ﷺ was establishing the da'wah. He was dealing with a very aggressive enemy of Islam. The people of Quraysh were aggressively against him. And the verses that were revealed were really addressing those mega issues: belief, disbelief, the hereafter. the verses tend to be shorter verses. Like the greatest example is Surah Al-Muddathir. Ya ayyuha al-Muddathir, qum fa'andir, wa rabbuka fakabbir. They're very short verses. Whereas the Medina verses, you'll find longer verses. Now, in the Medina verses, obviously the verses tend to be longer, the surahs tend to be longer, and the Medina verses are the verses that deal with fiqh. So any verse that you have that deals with actual acts of worship. The acts of worship are washing, tahara, preparing for prayer, purifying yourself, salah, I hope you guys know this. Sawm, i.e. we're in the month of Ramadan, I hope everyone knows that. And what did I miss? Zakah, you have to pay, and then Hajj and Umrah. These are acts of worship. So, and then by extension, you'll find verses that deal with inheritance law, verses that deal with the hudud punishments, capital punishments, torts, and things like that. Usually those verses tend to be Medina verses, meaning that the Prophet ﷺ has already established the state in Medina. He's the head of the state, he's the head of the judiciary. There's the Wathiqa of Medina, the constitution of Medina, which is a plural state. So the Muslims are a minority in charge of a non-Muslim majority. And everyone knows that the source of legislation is Allah and His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They can't solve a problem themselves and they go back to the Supreme Court, which is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So a lot of the verses deal with that. So this is important. This is one of the disciplines of how we understand the Quran. Number one, it's important always to know the order of the revelation as much as is possible. Maybe it's not an issue of abrogation, but maybe a later verse will restrict the meaning of a previous verse. And that's also important, and oftentimes a big mistake that people make when they interpret is they do not bring the pieces together. For example, one of the expiations for a certain sin in the Quran is وَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, to free a slave. Elsewhere, Allah Ta'ala says وَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ, to free a believing slave. So the ulama paste these two together and say the restrictive nature of the second verse, a believing slave, applies to all of the occasions in which a slave is to be freed. It means a believing slave. So you have to think, you have to put these things together. And in that process, you need to know as much as possible what was revealed before what, so you can understand what is impacting what, so you don't go the wrong way in the direction. I said in the beginning that all of the ulama of the different disciplines were concerned with issues of Mecca and Medina. Why? Because life in Mecca during the life of the Prophet ﷺ was very different than life in Medina after the Hijrah. The Hijrah is such a fundamental marker in our history. That's why the calendar starts with the Hijrah. And that was the ijtihad of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, that he started the Islamic calendar with what is year zero? Said it's with the Hijrah, because now Islam is completely different than it was in Mecca. Part of this is a little bit of a digression from the Quran theme that we have, but part of this, but it's important that you hear this, is you will find that some of the early fuqaha, they talk about things like Darul Islam and Darul Harb, the abode of Islam and the abode of war. And they take this from the description that they had of how the Prophet ﷺ lived in Mecca and how he lived in Medina. In Mecca, for example, there was no Salat al-Jum'ah. Even though at the time when Muslims had converted in Medina, they were praying Salat al-Jum'ah. But there was no Salat al-Jum'ah in Mecca. So the fuqaha of the Hanafi madhab especially, they said there are different rules that apply when you are a minority amongst the hostile majority versus when you are in a Muslim majority situation, even if numerically you are a minority, as the Muslims were in Medina, but the state was an Islamic state. Many people mistake this and they think that Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb are proscriptive. It's a hukm. It means that if you are a Muslim minority in a non-Muslim country, then you live in Dar al-Harb. That's incorrect. That's not what it means. These are descriptions. And oftentimes the people that say this, they forget that there is another middle part, which was when the Muslims went to Abyssinia. When the Muslims that was the first hijrah. The Muslims went to Abyssinia as a protected religious minority amongst a non-Muslim majority. And as a matter of fact, the Sahaba fought with the Najashi because his kingdom was attacked from another, I think his cousin or brother or something like that, attacked him, and the Muslims fought with the Najashi to defend their new homeland. So the idea of Mecca and Medina opens our mind to something greater, that there is a different way that the Sharia will manifest itself depending on our environment. Yani if you go to Las Vegas, that's one thing, and when you're in Mecca and Medina, it's something else. And you can't compare the two and say they're exactly the same. There's obviously some difference. There's obviously a difference. If you go to the grocery store here, you're going to find products, that for us are considered haram, but you don't blink. You just, whatever, that's what it is. But if you're in a Muslim majority country, if you saw those in a grocery store, you'd be like, what's wrong? Something is wrong. As a matter of fact, in most Muslim majority countries, they will have special sections in the supermarkets. It's like in a room, like pork products or something like that, or alcohol, to be able to sell to the non-Muslim population, which is permissible according to the Hanafi madhab, but it will be, tucked away. The point is that knowing Mecca and Medina, if you start to study the verses that were revealed here and the verses that were revealed in Medina, what we call Madanese verses, you will start to see that the way Islam was practiced in these two situations was different. The same principles, the haram is haram and the halal is halal, but the way it manifests itself becomes different. So this is one of the benefits of knowing the Meccan and the Medina verses. And then inshallah for tomorrow's episode, we're going to talk about tafsir. We'll talk about the different types of tafsir that we have, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.